Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. My name is Drew Clark. I am the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, spotlighting myself for just a few minutes to introduce our topic. Very excited to have a great crowd right now, and obviously future crowd, because these broadcasts, these webcasts that we do every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time are immediately available right after they conclude on Broadband Breakfast. So you can tune in and be part of the discussion, or you can watch online as part of our free programming right afterwards, whichever makes the most sense to you and your programming needs. We believe in better broadband, better lives. That's our motto at Broadband Breakfast. We bring people together around these themes of better broadband, better lives, and do reporting on these topics every business day. We also do these events, Broadband Breakfast Live Online, every Wednesday, as mentioned. And I just wanted to take a few minutes to mention a couple upcoming things that are really significant and really exciting that are happening in the broadband space. And these are linked to the page for the event. So a little bit later, I'll send that through the chat stream for those of you who are watching via Zoom. But I wanted to just highlight a couple in kind of order of happening next. There is going to be a webinar this afternoon at 3 o'clock. This is with one of our sponsors, Broadband.money. I'll be participating in that. Plan and execute a winning broadband grant strategy now. That will take place at 3 o'clock, and the link to participate is on the page for this event. Later this week on Friday and Saturday is the 50th anniversary of the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference. This is, again, 50 years of TPRC is taking place on Friday and Saturday. Not too late to register and attend. It is the event that brings together the world of academics, policy people, and people in the public interest and business communities who are focused on vital topics of broadband research, including broadband data and mapping, which is kind of underneath a lot of discussions that are happening. In fact, let me take a moment right now to mention our next topic for Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Next week, during our free Broadband Breakfast Live Online programming, we're going to be talking about broadband mapping and data. And so that's next Wednesday at September 21st. And then the following week, I will be doing a special master class on broadband mapping. This will cover in a comprehensive way some of the issues and controversies surrounding broadband mapping at the current moment. And this will be a 2-hour special. You can register and attend. It is a paid event, so we hope that you will register and attend to get this distilled knowledge about broadband mapping and data. And finally, we are extremely pleased to announce that we are going to be doing Digital Infrastructure Investment Washington. This is our annual conference that we at Broadband Breakfast host. We've done it together with the Broadband Communities Summit every year. They hold their conference in the spring. We've decided it's appropriate to do a fall conference because there's so much that we need to discuss on digital infrastructure investment. So more details will be forthcoming, but we want you to save the date. That's Thursday, November 17th. And again, the link to it is on the page for this event, which I will send out shortly. Once again, I want to give a shout out to all of the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. I mentioned Broadband.money. The other sponsors include Utopia Fiber, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Lightbox, Ookla, Michael Baker International, Pinpoint Capital Advisors, Geo Partners, Bitstream Communications, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to all of our sponsors for their contributions. So with that brief intro, I want to tee up our topic for today. And I didn't necessarily mean this to be overly controversial, but I'm sure it will be still. We're going to talk today about how cities can take advantage of federal broadband funding. And the reason this comes up is that we all know that broadband isn't just a problem in rural areas. I mean, we do know that broadband is a problem in rural areas, but we know that there are many parts of cities that do not have good quality access or affordable access. And the Biden administration has also made a really big emphasis on the affordability component. So that's something we certainly will come up to and come up with in this discussion. But there is, in my kind of taking the pulse of this space, there's an increasing worry that cities might be left out of the wealth of resources being made available through the bipartisan infrastructure funding measure. And we're particularly going to ask and focus on whether the focus on quote unserved and quote underserved communities may impede local government's ability to access infrastructure investment and jobs funding. Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. We're going to learn more about just that question from our four panelists here today. And so with that, I want to go ahead and open the view up to everyone. We, again, are very excited to welcome our four panelists for today. Let me just introduce them briefly, and then we'll turn to hear brief comments and introductory remarks from each of them. First, we're going to hear from Scott Menhart. Scott is in the Chief Information Technology Office and is that Chief Information Technology Officer for Traverse City Light and Power. So he's got extensive experience, decades of experience in technology and broadband, and has worked very closely in this city-based project. So we want to hear Travis's perspective on this question of broadband funding for cities. Following our first speaker, we're going to hear from Brianna Reed Harmel, and Brianna is the Municipal Fiber Manager for Pulse. And Pulse is the community-driven and community-owned fiber optic network in Loveland, Colorado. So another municipal owned, municipal-run network, as I understand it. We'll get any clarifications if we need any. And so Brianna also has a good deal of experience, 20 years of experience in engineering and leadership roles in the public and private sectors. And she was named the Municipal Fiber Manager or working in the city of Loveland is Nathan Hoople. Nathan is a senior project manager for Detesco. I hope I got that right, which is a company, and he'll explain more, of course, about the role that Detesco plays in networks, including Loveland's, but others as well, and has done a variety of large, prior to joining the companies with now, he was responsible for a variety of large infrastructure projects for the National Science Foundation's Antarctic program. So that's cool. I wonder if we have fiber to the igloo yet. Oh, well, sorry, fiber to the no Space Resource Center. Anyway, we'll hear more, or we won't hear more about Antarctica. And finally, batting cleanup will be Andrew Butcher. Andrew is welcome. Andrew, the inaugural president of the Maine Connectivity Authority. So we all know Peggy Schaefer, great friend of so many of ours. She's been on multiple of our programs. Peggy has retired. Andrew is in that role, as I understand it. Maybe he'll explain more about the specifics of what he's doing as the agency, as the head of the agency, serving as the primary entity charged with achieving universal access of affordable high-speed broadband in Maine. So, and we'll also hear about why we're having a state official on a discussion about cities, but we'll leave that to when we hear from Andrew. So with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Scott. Tell us a little bit about both Traverse City and some of the ways that you're thinking about the infrastructure project that is out there right now. So Scott, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, Drew. Much appreciated. Traverse City is a community located in northern Michigan, just shy of the Upper Peninsula. We have been deploying fiber for various reasons throughout the city, starting with dark fiber from 2006 on. We're currently actively deploying our fiber to the premise portion, which is we've been hooking up portions of the community in a phased approach. So these opportunities for these grant programs and these initiatives of the BEAD are something that very much interests us, because overall the long-term goal and initiative of Traverse City and Traverse City Light and Power is to serve broadband for the greater community of Northern Michigan at its entirety. And so Traverse City, unlike or like many smaller cities and communities, is a very dense pocket of population, and then it gets very quickly rural, which then goes into the underserved, and those definitions of what the BEAD is looking at in terms of those. And that's something that we're very closely following because of the implications of receiving that money and what it's going to do for those areas. And as they start looking towards really defining and honing in what that means, that's something that we're obviously paying very close attention to. There's other restrictions, just to get it out there in terms of the opening remarks, some restrictions that we're looking at too that exist within the opportunity is, the taxable income portion of it, the Build Back Better, things like that. The more restrictions they put into the program, the harder it is to be for applicants, including cities that don't have a lot of resources that are building these things to better the community without a lot of resources, as something like Big Telco have, is they're not aware of all the limitations and or restrictions that are being applied. And our concern is that if it goes forward in that matter, are people going to end up defaulting because they weren't fully grasping all the hoops they had to jump through in the beginning? And so just really understanding it at its core is something that really is of interest to my community and my board. Drew, I think you're on mute.
Yes, it happens to everyone. Thank you for walking us through that. Scott, would you mind saying just another word or two about what kind of support Traverse City has been able to obtain, if any, in previous broadband funding efforts? I mean, recent ones because of the pandemic. And since, in other words, did you or did any city near you or in your community kind of benefit or take advantage of American Rescue Plan or other funds of that sort?
No, we actually did not, especially not for the broadband infrastructure. We did work with the USDA on a loan that they've just awarded us, and we're going through the final paperwork on that now. And they're giving us around 14.2 million, I believe, is the over to help us build out some of those areas. But that is not going to touch the core county community that we're trying to serve. That's where really these BEAD opportunities come into play. And so that's where we're going to be applying for some of those, because it really is underserved, and hooking up those more rural communities is, drives that dollar amount up significantly, cost per customer wise.
Great, thank you for that additional context there. Let's now go to our second speaker, Brianna Reed Harmel. Tell us a little bit about Loveland and what you're seeing in Loveland and some of the unique opportunity that exists because of the history of success that you've enjoyed there.
Absolutely. So City of Loveland, we're located north of Denver by about 45 miles. So we're on what's called the Front Range of Colorado, kind of at the foothills. So we're in that area where it starts to get flat as you move into the Midwest. We started our project in 2016 with a feasibility study that ultimately led to us starting a municipal utility. We do have an electric utility that we piggybacked off of. So we're part of that electric utility, even though we're operationally separate. And that's actually where I started my career here at the City of Loveland, and then moved into this role that we're in now. We started construction in 2018, or actually 2019. We started our planning in 2018. And we're about 60% of our city is actually open for sale. When we were doing our feasibility study, one of the things that we found is that even though we're considerably suburban, we're just, north of Denver, we have a lot of pockets of our community that were really underserved. So our incumbents were picking and choosing places that what that they wanted to serve and leaving the rest out, which is really what prompted our community to move forward with municipalization and doing it for ourselves. So one of our real big tenets has been to make sure that we're not leaving anybody behind and we're not leaving out any pockets. But the reality of what's actually happening is that we do end up having pockets in our community because the incumbents have put locks on trailer parks or apartment complexes or other areas that you have large pockets of lower income folks living in that we simply can't get access to. And I think that that's been really a big issue for us as we've moved through our community and realizing that even though we have these tenants and this intention of serving everyone, we literally can't get to everyone who needs it. And that has been a huge issue. And I'm not really sure how the NTIA is going to be able to address that with their upcoming grants. We've had a lot of conversations with our state officials about that as well. And so that's certainly something that's on the top of our mind as we move into this next phase. We have been a little bit successful with some additional grants through our state broadband office. We partnered with our state and our school district here. So Thompson School District is our local school district. And during the middle of the pandemic, they received grant funding to help build out to some of the rural areas that we serve as an electric utility, but we're not part of our initial funding for our initial build out. So our initial build out was through revenue bonds with our electric utility. It covered just the city limits, but doesn't serve the areas outside of the immediate city boundaries, what we call the urban fringe here in Larimer County. And those are the areas that are being left out. And we're really working hard to try to figure out how do you get those areas to be considered in these BEAD grants, because they are sometimes in census blocks that are considered covered, but they oftentimes don't have the type of coverage that you would see inside of a suburban area, and they're being left out. And so we've actually not received grants on some of these areas that we've applied to earlier on in the NTIA process because the maps are not up to date and the maps aren't accurate. We're hoping that some of the changes to those new maps will help with that, but we're cautiously optimistic about that piece. So there's a lot going on as far as like just the areas as you kind of start to move into the rural areas that are really being left out by our municipal build outs.
So how long has, I guess Pulse is the name, how long has that been operating in Loveland? And did you have any kind of a struggle to get going there?
We launched in June 2020, so right as everybody was going into lockdown in the pandemic. And so that was a very interesting time. We actually had to do a virtual launch party just like this. So I've been doing a lot of Zoom meetings over the last couple of years. But we're 60% through our community. So about 60% of the city itself is actually available for service. And we're seeing, decent take rate conversion to our product in about that 30% range to start with, which is really great. Exactly what our business plan said we were supposed to be at. So.
Great. Well, perhaps we'll come to more questions. Please, for those who are attending our discussion, feel free to start sending questions now, either on Zoom or on the other platforms. Let's go ahead and get the perspective of Nathan in terms of telling us a little bit about your piece and your role, and maybe some of the other neighboring communities besides Loveland that you've worked with.
So thank you. So I work for a company, Ditesco. We're focused a lot on municipal broadband, and we focus in that municipal space. And so we work very closely with Brianna to try not only in the kind of construction management of build of her municipal fiber, but trying to bring some regional collaboration. And that's where I think the perspective for this discussion maybe is a little bit useful, is that we work with the city of Fort Collins, their connection municipal broadband. We're working with Larimer County from the county side, along with some other smaller municipalities along the Front Range, and some county consortiums in Southern Colorado, with the idea of trying to solve this funding, middle mile, some certain gaps in order to bring fiber to underserved areas. And so as we've been involved with Brianna, we've closely linked and tried to start and foster this kind of regional collaboration where all of these groups are at the table trying to work together in order to solve our community's fiber issues. And Brianna mentioned one of the NTIA grants that was unsuccessful due to kind of the mapping issues. And I think we've also heard a lot about speed test data, that if you have your own speed test data, provide it as far as these grant applications. And we just recently got a debrief from an unsuccessful grant application that had kind of indicated those same things, but admitted they didn't look at our speed test data, even though they recognized that their data isn't necessarily whole. They decided not to even look at supplemental speed test data to evaluate, and partly because of the fact that they had so many applications for funding. And so I guess from my perspective, there's some of these rules that are kind of out there as unofficial rules that maybe aren't part of the discussion, aren't being followed necessarily. And how do we get that to be part of the evaluation process?
So Nathan, tell us a little bit about your perspective of sort of cities versus suburban fringe and rural areas, right? So again, we'll get in soon enough to this kind of rural urban question, but from the perspective of Ditesco and what you're doing, where you're building, talk a little bit about the areas, the densities, whether in your view cities are kind of without any funding getting the kind of coverage deployment they need, or are there still problems in that regard, whether they are cities or suburban areas?
I think it is certainly a challenge. There's a lot of focus on affordability, but a lot of the rules seem around some of these grant applications are more focused on speed and having a large enough area that fully fits within that underserved and unserved criteria. One of the things that our strategy has been, because of this potential issue with BEAD funding, is utilizing existing funding, whether it be ARPA, that the counties or municipalities have gotten their hands on and want to try to solve their fiber and broadband issues, is to start building out that urban fringe now with some of the ARPA funding that doesn't have quite the same restrictions, in order to get further towards those rural areas where we feel we can be more successful. And so we're encouraging municipalities, certainly smaller ones that are getting into the game right now, if they can bring money to the table to get some of their harder to define areas as underserved, start working on those areas first, because then it gives them a launch pad to get into these better defined areas that were more likely to receive funding.
All right. Thank you again. Let's hear from Andrew. Thanks for turning your video on, Andrew. We're really excited. Tell us a little about Maine Connectivity Authority and the role that you play in the state, and in particular, kind of the role of cities within that state connectivity program.
Thanks. Thanks, Drew. Cities. I'm sorry. I thought I was here for waffles. I thought we were going to talk breakfast, which is a specialty of mine. Happy to talk a little bit about the Maine Connectivity Authority, some of the dynamics in Maine and how we're approaching urban areas. Although I am going to skip to the end immediately, because I think Nathan just captured a really, really important point that I would underscore, which is that ultimately that urban and rural areas should be working in cohesion to leverage funding and needs. Ultimately, especially in a place like Maine, regional approaches are key. So I'll circle back to that, but I just want to sort of start and underline it. The Maine Connectivity Authority is Maine's broadband agency. Drew, earlier you mentioned some of the work that Peggy Schaefer has done. As you mentioned, she's retired. This year, in the last year, the Maine legislature created the Maine Connectivity Authority to be a proactive and robust agency on behalf of the state as a quasi-governmental entity. And we collectively designed it to merge with and integrate with the former state office, which was housed in our Department of Economic and Community Development, and was the office that Peggy ran before she retired. So we've, in the last year, we've started up, hired staff, merged organizations, designed and developed programming, and are in motion to deploy. And again, serve as our state broadband agency and are sort of designated eligible to receive our federal funding to facilitate our master planning processes and to fulfill the state statutory goals around broadband, which comes down to universal and affordable broadband for everyone as soon as possible. So just, I see a couple of friendly faces in the audience. I guess I'll just sort of highlight a couple of key challenges and insights from a Maine standpoint. We live in a big state with a lot of space and not a lot of humans. Our cities are small, and our rural demand is quite high. To put it in perspective, the population of Maine is about 1.3 million people, but the state is about 3/4 the size of Pennsylvania. That has our entire population being smaller than the county that surrounds the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Our largest 3 cities constitute just over 100,000 people combined. Those are our largest 3 cities, and they're geographically spread out throughout the state. And not to mention that as a true and blue New England state, there's a strong emphasis on home rule. But all that to sort of say is that population and size doesn't matter when it comes to people's need to connect to each other and the global economy. So a significant amount of our state strategy does need to revolve around the projects, places, and people from a rural demand and from a rural problem standpoint. However, as I mentioned earlier, how we approach regional solutions is key to defining scale. So when you don't have a lot of money, you do planning. And until recently, a state like Maine didn't really have a whole lot of money to address the issue. We only passed our first public bond for broadband investments in 2020 at a $15 million bond, of which 75% of the voter electorate was supportive of. And so what's been successful in Maine is recognizing that broadband is a true and blue community development issue. Where there are equipped and engaged and informed communities, they play a critical role in driving demand. And that demand, as we all know in broadband, translates to a very real economic indicator that allows for a public-private partnership to justify an investment of capital and infrastructure. So Maine has recognized that. We've tried to prioritize that over the last couple of years through groups like the Maine Broadband Coalition, and fuel and support and really mobilize a community-driven approach to broadband planning at a hyper-local level. And so now, with that track record of success and with that sort of orientation towards a community development approach, we now, I think, are in a really good position to think about how we address the issue from a scale standpoint, and scale in Maine has to be at a regional level. Urban cores should be collaborating with suburban and rural areas and for a cohesive design, not just to leverage the available funding, as Nathan had mentioned, in the way in which underserved and unserved areas are better suited for ARPA funding. It also represents an aggregated demand in an urban area that makes for a better case in a public-private partnership development. A couple things that we've been trying to do is at a state level, not quite require, but make it quite clear that a local match at a municipal level is essential as we look at regional scale solutions, trying to support the governance and connective tissue through things like regional utility districts, which would build from a municipally owned, community owned model. Maine has statutory authority to allow incentives for efficiency, like municipal exemption for utility pole make-ready costs. That represents a pretty significant, for the broadband nerds in the group, as you know, that's going to be a bit of a tricky issue. We have yet to have a municipality take it up because it certainly represents a potential conflict with pole owners. But there's that exemption in place, and we have an interest in helping facilitate technical assistance for communities and regional partnerships to pursue that type of approach. I also, and Drew, I'm talking fast, so feel free to cut me off if you want, but I want to just highlight the sort of incentives of efficiency around outreach and engagement in an urban context, which again translates to some of our partners and strategies at a statewide level. Mentioned already the role of partners like the Maine Broadband Coalition, which is a diverse network of communities, local government, private companies, and technology companies. Key partners like AARP serve a critical role in engaging and leveraging existing networks. The age-friendly community networks through AARP is a multi-state initiative, and it represents a set of already engaged stakeholders who can be pulled into the broadband planning process and directly imported in a more direct and targeted way. Also allows for us to develop a more proactive approach towards municipal education. We've been partnering with the Maine Municipal Association, our chambers of commerce, again, thinking about how do we leverage existing networks to convey information and to help identify approaches towards regional scale solutions. The last thing I'll just emphasize, Drew, I see you hopping in. You wanted to hop in there. I don't know how much time.
No. Go ahead and make this last point. This is great.
I think this is where, from a state standpoint, looking at our cities as they should be from an innovation lab standpoint, as we prepare for the future, certainly as we build out the level of connected infrastructure that we are right now, our reliance and demand isn't going to wane. And the way in which we approach our broadband infrastructure is the way in which we're going to need to approach our comprehensive connected infrastructure for smart and connected devices, the Internet of Things. As we integrate an agricultural economy that's more dependent on distributed sensors, working with municipal and city partners to leverage and identify partnerships to evaluate that kind of future demand, again, plays into not just a future demand, but also equates to what will be a digital equity strategy and set of policies at an urban level. So there's a couple of ways in which we're thinking about it from a statewide level.
Oh, fabulous! This now I see why your colleagues at the National League of Cities were so keen to have you participate, Andrew, because this really does bring, I think, a core topic to the core, which is namely the urban core, the suburban periphery, the rural, how they need to be thought of together, right? How we need to think about, even in areas where we may be quote unquote served, we have to make sure the builds include them, right? And for goodness sake, many of them, even though they are claimed to be served, are not served, or they do not have sufficient broadband actually there. So let's see if others have some take. And we got some great questions. Keep them coming. I want to ask a question that's been asked just after this one. So talk to all of our guests and attendees, watchers here. What are some of the ways that urban, suburban, and rural areas need to or are working together on broadband projects? Scott and Brianna, do you want to weigh in on that too?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I think Nathan talked a little bit about this, and he can certainly elaborate. But we, obviously we're focused on the city first, but our electric utility does serve areas outside. The other is that we're very tightly connected to our county, because they have a strong desire to make sure that everyone in the county is served, not just their urban areas. And so we have been working very closely to try to push our municipal or infrastructure outside of our city limits. And so in Northern Colorado, there's actually 3 or 4 entities that are municipal entities that are doing this, are providing broadband to their city constituents. So we have the city of Fort Collins, city of Loveland, the town of Estes Park, and the city of Longmont. But because we're not serving the areas just outside of the communities, that we've started to have a lot of discussions with the county about moving that boundary out and making sure we're not leaving people behind. And it's a lot easier for us to push that network out than to have, to have an overbuild from someone else. The other is that our cooperative, or we have an electric cooperative that serves the areas outside of the cities. They don't have an interest in moving into a broadband space. They've gone through that investigation and determined that it's not in their wheelhouse, but they want their members to have broadband services. And so they're very interested in working very closely with the cities in order to help us provide that service without them doing it themselves.
Great. Scott?
Yeah, I can piggyback onto that one. Brianna's situation is a lot like our situation, right? We did original study on who was going to be the broadband provider for Traverse City. We were going to form a new city department. Was it going to piggyback on the electrical side of it? And ultimately, we ended up piggybacking it onto the electrical side of it because the electrical was already doing some fiber communications for its electrical grid. And so it was a no-brainer from wire management to pole to accessing, permitting issues and all that. The electrical company already had a lot of that foundation already laid for the electrical footprint. But as Brianna mentioned, our electrical footprint extends beyond the city limits as well in certain areas, those urban fringe areas that we like to talk about, and where our broadband initiative stops right at the city limits just due to funding constraints and or limitations of some of those funding opportunities that we're having. And so when you look at some of that, how to address in terms of getting those communities involved that might be right out of the city proper, because that was our first focus. And then as we expand into those areas that make logical sense, there's dense populations of people, and even not even the rural side of it, they need to be served as well. And that is our take. And when we see some of the incumbents that do come into the area, they cherry pick, very, very dense, high revenue points of interest for deployment. They're not looking at the community and the area as a whole holistic approach. And so that's where we stepped in and said, look, we can't just focus on areas of we've got to cover everybody for this. That is our goal. And that's why government has stepped up to be in the broadband initiative, is to get fair and equal access to everybody. And so that was our mission on the electric side, safe, reliable electric power. We're doing the same thing on the fiber side and the broadband side. It just really goes into how do you work with those communities, like that are outside of the city proper, which we serve as the local city government, you're getting into counties or other cities or other townships. We've done a grassroots campaign to start working with any one of those community leaders in there, and we've signed on with them to start helping push that initiative as a collective, rather than it coming solely from Traverse City Light and Power, the city of Traverse City. It's now coming from a collective pack of individuals and community leaders of all these fringe, more rural areas of population that want it, and their leaders are now signing on, giving letters of support, and that we're packaging that up to help spearhead that. But you're right, there is no clear definition between those urban fringe areas. Are they underserved? Are they not? And often they are, but they're counted as part of the city, because it's like, well, the city of Traverse City has adequate cover, so these people that live 1 mile outside of the city must also, and that is just simply not true.
So go ahead. Please chime in, Nathan.
I was just going to make a comment kind of stemming onto this, is at least in our region, we are probably somewhat unique in that we have 4 municipal fiber broadband providers that are interested in working together and kind of reaching further out into the underserved areas. We also have a number of communities that are looking along the typical P3 route. And at least in our region, what we're finding is that partly likely due to this definition of underserved and unserved, is there are some of these P3 agreements also that happen to be falling through. It's those municipalities that can't necessarily afford to put up very much money on their side of it. And so they're looking for a P3 agreement to help fund that, because they don't have their own power infrastructure. But what we're finding over the last 6 to 9 months is a lot of these P3 agreements are falling through because the private provider is pulling back their level of service and their level of commitment to the community, and saying, well, we're only going to serve the people that we feel like we can profit off of, or we're going to base it off of these underserved maps and only hit areas that these underserved maps say are underserved, because we don't want to overinvest. And so some of these communities feel like they're getting left behind because these P3 agreements are also falling through, and are now reaching out and to the county to say, hey, how can you help us? We're having this difficulty. We hear that you have these municipal providers that are interested in sort of coming at it from a collaborative approach. How do we solve this issue?
Andrew, let me ask a question here, and you can comment on this, but Michael Shear asks, Andrew, is there any coordination with transportation initiatives to deploy broadband as a dig once strategy? Are there any integration strategies to build on education, medical, and emergency service network investments? And I might mention, during our event in late July, I believe it was the 27th or 26th of July, we went to Morgan, Utah, a rural community on the other side of the main Wasatch Front that was able to be served because of a long line that the State Department of Transportation built from downtown Salt Lake City across that mountain pass to that rural community. So that's a perfect example of that, responding to Michael's question, but Andrew, it was asked of you. So what thoughts do you have on that?
Sure. Well, good to hear a shout out of good coordination between broadband and transportation in Utah. I know my colleague Rebecca Dilg is the state broadband leader in Utah, and I think she's here today as well. And so I think, quite honestly, as the Connectivity Authority got started up, I was asked to meet with the Commissioner of Transportation for the state of Maine, and we sat down, and he said unabashedly that the future of transportation in Maine is the future of connectivity. We've got 35 million vehicles per year that come into the state, as Maine is a highly trafficked vacation land. And in 15 years, 50% of those vehicles are going to require continuous connectivity. And so what is that going to look like? So we, as a result, we established a shared feasibility assessment to identify high priority transportation corridors, of which we could look to build and share infrastructure and or evaluate commercial analysis, and also established a shared staffing position between the agencies. So we have a shared, I think Utah is a leader in this as well. We have a shared broadband liaison that is a part MCA employee, part DOT employee. And that's also allowed for us to identify a couple high priority initiatives and policy issues, Dig Once being one of them. Maine has a Dig Once policy. It is not a universal policy that is integrated into all municipal activities. Again, given the strong emphasis on home rule, that's an area for us to expand upon. The state, from a city standpoint, the state transportation department has only has so much influence. Again, that's also an opportunity where regional councils of governments and regional planning offices play a really critical role. Our broadband and road infrastructure doesn't stop at municipal boundary. So coordinated regional scale policies like Dig Once are really critical. But again, that partnership has also allowed for us to identify the right kind of wireless projects that are going to address, in our case, highly remote and rural areas. But that also represents, again, the kind of opportunity to explore innovative technologies and partnerships in an urban context.
Do others have thoughts on either transportation or other public partnerships that can enable the kind of coordination between rural and urban areas? Let's ask this question that Robert C. asks. What is the role of municipal utilities to provide broadband, a Chattanooga model or regional electric cooperatives? Loveland, for example, are you a municipal utility city, Brianna?
We're definitely a municipal utility, but I think that there's a role for, depending on your region, it probably is not a one size fits all situation. I mean, we're a municipality, so it makes sense for us to do this here, but we work really closely with some of the rural co-ops that here in Colorado, like Delta Montrose, which has Elevate, and others here that are doing public broadband, I think, is really what we're talking about at the end of the day, because we're here for the citizens. We're owned by the citizens to which we serve. And there's a lot of benefit to not being in that profit model, because we care about everyone and we're trying to serve everyone regardless of, where they are.
Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and I think that underscores kind of the critical role of municipal utility districts or regional utility districts from a public ownership standpoint. And I think that one of the things that, one of the reasons I was excited to participate in this conversation is that, I spent the last couple of years working through the state on broadband at the Maine Broadband Coalition prior to this role, but also in a dual role as working on innovation and resilience through the Greater Portland Council of Governments. The majority of my career has been in urban affairs. And what I'll say is that urban policy wonks don't quite speak broadband. Most people can't get into a broadband nerd conversation in the way in which most people on this call will. The joy and misery of working on broadband is that everybody comes to it from a very different level of understanding. We can all learn, but it takes a ramp up phase. And I think the point that, municipal utility districts play a critical role in bridging the equitable development policies and social justice priorities with an actual infrastructure policy and operating model. And so in an urban scale, and also at a regional scale, this is the opportunity. And this is why I think the infusion of funds, the dedicated funding for digital equity planning, and then also the digital equity implementation that will take shape through the BEAD program represent a really critical opportunity to engage as diverse array of networks and communities as possible, of which our urban areas represent the most amount of opportunity. There's dedicated emphasis and exemption for multiple dwelling units, affordable housing units. So the ability to engage all pockets of community that typically don't find themselves in a broadband planning dialogue requires us, from a broadband space, to be more proactive in engaging partnerships with urban affairs policy wonks, such that they're clear around the function and utility of an operating model like a municipal utility district.
Let's talk for a minute about digital equity and the training component that you just mentioned, Andrew. And there's a project also in Utah. So I got a number of Utah examples today. It's called the Herbal Remedy, right? Rural urban, right? Rural urban. The Herbal Remedy, which is basically to bring the training of city locations to rural facilities, right? And so in a way to kind of get jobs and training is a key part of that from urban to rural areas. The program really took off when jobless rate was higher than it is now. But obviously, I wonder if others have some thoughts on the question of how we make sure. And I think, Andrew, you've said this so well of the urban policy people aren't really speaking broadband, perhaps in the way that rural folks may be more attuned to that. This has been on a lot of rural policy agendas much longer, perhaps, than urban. But I want to get the perspectives of some of our city operators, Brianna, Scott, and Nathan.
This is actually,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Scott.
I just think, from a digital equity standpoint, that's where, municipalities or local governments really strive to achieve, right? I mean, that is the reality of what we're trying to do, where, nothing against, private sector businesses or big telco, but they're going to follow the money. They're going to follow where the most bang for their buck is, where we have this overarching need to have everybody treated fairly in and around our region, if not the nation, right? And that's the presence of these types of meetings, right? We're all in agreement that there needs to be something done in terms of getting everybody equal access to an opportunity for broadband or technical services. And what that is and how that's defined, obviously that's going to be shooken out over the years to come. But the reality is, from a muni level, we can start implementing stuff now for the local community and hope it catches on.
And its ability to cruise. at 2,300 miles an
Remember to
hour
mute
for
yourself
about an
if you
hour at a
are
time.
not on
The
the,
aircraft
which I've just done. Brianna, I want to hear your thought on this, but let me actually pull up a question that Michael Shear asked early in the conversation. He said that, Brianna, you mentioned working with the school district. Have you brought together education, healthcare, and workforce development leaders together to consider aggregate needs and opportunities? So that thought and this other thought, Brianna, if you'd weigh in on.
Yeah, I think they actually tie together great. It's actually been a really hot topic for our community over the summer months, with how do we take this digital equity program to the next level? Obviously, we participate in the ACP program at Pulse, but that's not really addressing the full needs of our community. It only addresses the internet access piece. It doesn't address devices. It doesn't address training. It doesn't address digital literacy and all these other pieces that you really need to do to have a comprehensive movement forward of your community. And so we have actually just started working very closely with our county workforce development group to try to leverage our resources and their resources and put it together in a way that's comprehensive. And that follows in with the projects that we're working on with the school district, things that we're doing at the library with adult education, and trying to make sure that we don't have these little pockets of activity that are happening all throughout our, larger, not just city community, but larger community, but trying to bring those together in a way that is comprehensive and makes, you actually makes a significant impact rather than just having, you address a little bit here, but it falls down because you don't have follow-up for the next piece. So that's actually just starting here in the Larimer County area. It's a great topic, and I think it's the next thing that needs to be really addressed.
Drew, can I actually ask a question and follow up? Because I think that that's such a good illustration of the diverse sector engagement and how municipally driven effort is engaging those kinds of networks. How are you capturing the insights from whether your libraries, schools, workforce development partnerships? How are you capturing that and sharing it with respective municipal departments?
Just through communication, really. I mean, one of the benefits of being a municipality is that we know who the right players are, and we do have some programs that do focus on, like the library has an adult literacy or an adult education group. And so making sure we tap into those teams and start having regular conversations with them and trying to give them resources to better utilize their program and help, promote the ACP program, not just for Pulse, but for the other providers and those types of things, and making sure that they understand that those are things that are out there. It's literally just having those marketing and outreach programs through us, trying to bring that together.
You've just mentioned the Affordable Connectivity Program, ACP. We've had some questions here. Robert C. asked, what about driving full utilization of the Affordable Connectivity Program to support the affordability component of digital equity? Daniel Smith observes that ACP can drive revenue and equity. Does anyone else want to add anything about the role of the Affordable Connectivity Program in your communities or the broader kind of, again, rural urban core that needs to be thought of in this discussion?
Drew, I'll just hop in and state what is probably the obvious, which is that there's good evidence out there that only a fraction of eligible participants are utilizing the program, and I think there was a lot of foresight in the Digital Equity Act to establish dedicated funding for groups to do outreach. And that's not just our municipal governments or state broadband offices. That really should be money that we deploy to the grassroots communities and networks to help understand and spread the word and help onboard eligible participants, right? It's no different than low-income energy credits or low-income energy assistance programs. We should be using this opportunity to invest in the process to enhance and strengthen those grassroots networks and pull them into a coordinated broadband effort. So we allow for municipal officials to have the demand from a grassroots standpoint driving a regional scale approach such that then municipal leaders are able to work with rural partnerships to leverage those funding and capture a greater demand and put together a larger scale initiative to put forward for either public-private partnership or municipal initiatives.
We've got some questions from Kelsey Howard. She asks, what is the process for a municipality, city, county that doesn't have it or a loan for that study task? I don't know if any particular person would like to take this. Obviously, you do have your own electric utility in Loveland, and is the same the case in Traverse?
Same's the case in Traverse, but I'll take it. I think we follow the same, while having an electric utility offers advantages, right, in terms of pole access and easements and things like that, and knowing how to run a wires company already, I think you still follow the same general consensus that you would follow in any business deployment, right? You have a feasibility study to see whether or not it's going to be worth deploying to the area. You put together a business plan, you find your anchor tenants, and you find your root people that you want to serve to start bringing revenue back as soon as the monetize the network to bring revenue back as soon as possible from deployment strategy. And then you look and find the niche in your community, which they're there. It's not always broadband centric, where we work with various departments that have nothing to do with electrical. So we'll work with the Downtown Development Authority to offer Wi-Fi in some of their TIF district spots. Well, we work with the police, local PD here to help do security cameras as a service that's back end by our fiber. So we'll do things like that where we had. And so I think each community that you look at doing it has their own special niche above and beyond broadband. Broadband is a significant piece of it for your community, but like there's other things that you can do to get into the game that actually benefit the community as a whole or the other departments. And like Brianna did, we also, when we started building, the first thing we did is involve our local school system. So we deployed to all the public and private partner school systems. We both did, lit fiber and dark fiber services to connect all their locations together. We did that with the hospitals too. And so, one thing that we're pushing further now is the local school system is to do an incentive for, underserved and or, children that don't have proper access at home. Is there something that we can do partnering with them to expand our services, for free or a portion or reduced rate to either allow layer 2 traffic back to the school where they give them broadband, or something just from a e-learning ability, if they're not getting enough through the ACP program, so there's things that are there, but in terms of if you don't have an electric utility, you got to follow the same steps and go through it and really educate the community to see if the need is there.
And I will say that our original feasibility study was actually not funded by our electric utility. It was actually funded through our general fund with money pulled from like economic development and some other places, because it was recognized that we needed to do something. There was no conclusion that it was ultimately going to be a municipal utility that we formed. Which then was housed with electric at the end of the day. But originally it was a general fund project because it was related to economic development and equity.
And we were in the same boat. We were very close to doing the same thing. We've met with all the city leaders, city manager, and we had dual meetings for the better part of 2 years to decide where we were going to ultimately put this. And it really started at the city level. The city wanted economic development, and then it ultimately got placed with the electrical utility. But I think from a muni perspective, a city can drive it without an electrical company just as easy. There are advantages having an electrical company, but it's not necessary.
I mean, it makes me very jealous. Our electric utilities and co-ops are much less pervasive in Maine. So I'm jealous of some of that perspective, and it would be nice. I think I guess I would say that we can think about how it's worked and we can think about how it will work moving forward. And how it's going to work moving forward is that every state's going to have a digital equity plan, and there's going to be a distributed set of resources for digital equity engagement. And I think if you don't have an electric utility and that sort of like dedicated broadband advocate in place already, I think the sort of tenets of community development have to drive that process, and the digital equity planning work that everyone's going to be funded to do should be a catalyst in starting that planning process and identifying where are the pockets of demand in an urban context, because it might be affordable housing units, it might be public libraries, it might be schools, probably some combination of all the above. But I think that identification of key community stakeholders that are going to drive and own that process has to be the starting point.
So we are out of time. I appreciate the great discussion we've had from our panelists and from our questioners. Perhaps the one final thing to mention is a question that we're not going to answer, but it was raised by Robert Say again about the role of granular broadband maps showing actual individual household maps are key. And we are going to be talking about precisely this issue of broadband mapping and data next Wednesday at our Broadband Breakfast Live Online, 12 noon Eastern time. And don't miss the master class that I'll be leading on Tuesday, September 27th, a week following that discussion. On behalf of our guests, Brianna Reed-Harmel, Nathan Hoople, Scott Menart, and Andrew Butcher, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you